human beings throughout history never learn anything for long, and then they forget what it is they've learned. Throughout much of history, including 20th century history, violence has been used as a way of settling debates or stopping debates. Never thought that would come back. Well, it has with Charlie Kirk. I'm not using this in a political sense, because it's been weaponized by both sides. But once somebody has been killed in the way he was killed, you can't go back to what is before.
If you had to distill a central thread running through your work, what would it be? And were there any sort of early experiences, especially growing up in the Northeast at the end of the 50s and the early 60s, that informed this thread?
It's a very good and a very large question. I'll answer it as best I can, but I just came across a quote from General de Gaulle, someone I admire very much, who, when he was walking through the university area of Paris during the student upheavals of 1968, came across a graffiti which said, roughly translated, "Kill all the fools." And he turned to a reporter and said, "A vast project." So I'm not attempting to kill all the fools. I don't want to kill anybody, actually. But it's true that I have spent a large part of my work, especially since I left academic life in 2008, criticizing the idea, or as I would call it, the myth of progress. And I think the essence of that myth, or one of its central elements, is that a fact, the growth of knowledge in science, is a fact. Whatever you think about the way the COVID epidemic was administered, vaccines pretty much work. They may have more side effects that are allowed, but they work. There are just over 8 billion human beings alive on the planet because of intensive farming, refrigerators, global transport systems, and so on. I don't share the view that science is just a tissue of cultural constructions with no connections at all with an external reality. We can never be sure what that reality is. We can never be sure that our theories and hypotheses are latching on to that reality. But there must be some fit, or otherwise there would not have been the huge transformation, the huge growth of human power that there has been. Where I think the Enlightenment went wrong, and not only the Enlightenment, but even the Socratic Greek philosophy, which it renewed in early modern times, is in thinking that something like that was possible in ethics and politics, or if you like, the way we live. And I think that's what I have always rejected, or at least wanted to subject to critical doubt. Because I think what this supposes is that humans can learn from their mistakes and improve themselves over time, over the generations, in a kind of continuous cumulative fashion. So that in one generation, I mean, this is the way people think of progress as a kind of escalator. In one generation, you might deal with slavery or cruel punishments in penal systems. The next generation, you can expand democracy. A further generation, you can have more humane treatment of non-human animals, and so on and so forth. But actually, history isn't like that. Human events aren't like that. In my writings, I say, if anybody doubts progress, think of anesthetic dentistry. Not much downside to anesthetic dentistry. I had a cataract operation. That's progress. So there are some areas where there's a real improvement in human life which doesn't have a shadow, but they're rare. Nearly all big advances in science and technology can be used for destructive as well as constructive purposes. And what this relates to is the fact that the transmission of moral knowledge, moral sentiment, moral judgment is very easily disrupted. Hardly ever do you get a high level of freedom and peace and concord in society for more than 2 or 3 generations. Even when improvement is real, there's normally a shadow. And it's almost always, I would say always, reversed. And what is gained, sometimes there are real gains, is lost. And that's a hard thing for people in our generation, who've been raised on the idea that the next generation will be not just materially better off than the existing one, which, by the way, is now doubtful, very doubtful, but somehow morally even better off then.
And John, you were mentioning growing up in
Yeah.
Shields, and early on you saw an example of this idea that even often progress has a shadow to it as well.
Well, I grew up in one of these streets, which now many people say it's an urban legend. It wasn't. It was true. There were streets which were multi-generational. Whole families lived in them, grandparents, parents. The doors were never locked at night. That is true. There was very little or any street crime. Bit of violence at the pub in the night, in the rough behaviour. That's about it. People were safe. They had flaws, these societies. They were quite patriarchal. If you had strong individual ambitions, you usually had to leave. But they were in many ways, although life was hard and short for many people there, I think the lives that many people lived there were good. And I actually experienced what happened when they were levelled, because the decision was taken for good reasons, wasn't corruption, for good reasons, or what was seen to be good reason, to get rid of all of these old houses, because they didn't have mod cons, they didn't have internal baths, they didn't have central heating, they didn't have any of these things. So they were level. So the street I spent some of my early years in now only has one house standing in it now. We moved out, my family, to an orbital estate, a new estate, which embodied all the good intentions. All the streets were named after famous authors, Hardy, Wordsworth, poets and so on. But within about 6 months of being there, first of all, the families were segregated by age, which they hadn't been before. They were shaken up like marbles and deposited there. There wasn't much of an infrastructure. Graffiti appeared. There'd never been graffiti. Then vandalism. Because the assumption was you could put people in better, did have central heating, did have internal loose. Materially, it was much better off. But socially, culturally, as a way of a human form of life, it was worse off as I actually experienced. Now, what did I learn from that? Well, what I learned was, later when I read the philosopher Karl Popper, great liberal philosopher, George Soros, who I used to know quite well, takes him as his mentor, as a mentor, talks about piecemeal social engineering. He said, you shouldn't try and have revolutions like they had in Russia. What you should do is you should get the piecemeal social engineers to gradually solve problems in society. Well, that's an idea I've always abhorred. First of all, who are these piecemeal social engineers? How do they decide what are the problems in society? What if one value conflicts with another value? But the basic reason is human societies are not machines. They're more like spiders' webs. They're more like cobwebs. If you blunder in and move people suddenly to a new housing estate you've created in fields, which is what they were before, you can't expect the good features of their life before to go with them, and they didn't. So that bred in me a deep suspicion, not actually of revolution. Revolutions are inevitable. I benefited from a revolution. There was a revolutionary government in the British sense, came out of the Second World War. I still honour and admire the Labour government of 1945 to 50. And the war itself, terrible as it was in many ways, reduced, for example, dietary diseases fell because of rationing. There was full employment, which there hadn't been before. Women entered the workforce in a huge way into the factories. True, there were armaments factories, but they went into the workforce. After the war, they didn't go back to becoming domestic servants. Didn't want to. Why should they? So actually, the Second World War in Britain was a sort of revolutionary process, and a good one in many of its respects. But it didn't last forever. That Labour settlement, the Labour settlement of 1945 to 1950, by the 1970s was beginning to run out of steam. It was beginning to disintegrate, which is when I first got involved in politics in the early 70s, before Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party. That I met her before, and then later when she was leader, and even after she was toppled as leader, I met her occasionally. By the mid-70s, it was beginning to fall apart. And that illustrates another aspect in which I reject what might be called the story of progress. The one thing we learn from experience is that human beings throughout history never learn anything for long, and then they forget what it is they've learned. An example now, throughout much of history, including 20th century history, violence has been used as a way of settling debates or stopping debates. Never thought that would come back. Well, it has the Charlie Kirk. I'm not using this in a political sense because it's been weaponized by both sides. But once somebody has been killed in the way he was killed, you can't go back to what is before. So we're moving, I think, in that respect into a very dark way. But what I was going to talk about next was in the mid-70s, I became convinced that this Labour settlement, which I'd benefited so much from, which was in many ways very humane, but which had these strange examples of social engineering that had malignant effects, that was over. So what was needed was something completely new. And that's why I'm often criticized as being politically inconsistent or changing as politics change. Politics is not, for me, a universal project of human emancipation. Politics is a succession of partial and temporary expedients for dealing with recurring human evils. And they're different to some extent. They're recurring over history, but they're somewhat different in each generation. So these big experiments, even when they're highly successful, as I think the Labour experiment of 1945 was, don't last for long.
Thanks, John. Just going back a little bit from you, when you left South Shields, you went to Oxford, and at Oxford you met one of your key influences, Isaiah Berlin. I just wondered if you could talk for a few minutes just about what attracted you to Isaiah, and then also what you took from his thinking into your own thinking.
One of the things that attracted me is that as a little boy he'd witnessed both Russian revolutions. He was a little boy in Riga to begin with, and then in Russia. But it was all part of the Romanov Empire at that time, and he'd seen the first revolution in March or February, depending which calendar you use. And he said it was a wonderful experience. People went around kissing each other, embracing each other. There was a feeling of having gotten rid of a terrible tyranny, the Romanovs. That lasted a few months. And then by the second revolution, he said, fear was the dominant feeling, together with the love of power. And people began to appear in crowds dressed in leather jackets, who were representative of the secret police who had been created or Cheka by Lenin, and fear began to seep in. He stayed there for a few years, and then he and his family migrated to the West, where he had a different life. So one thing that interested me about him is that he was speaking from a position of experience which went on throughout his life. In the Second World War, he ended up in Washington, working at the British Embassy in Washington, and his job was to examine the shape of opinion in America as to going into the war with Britain, which most Americans and most politicians, and even Roosevelt himself, did not want to do. But he believed, as others believed, as Churchill, who he then came to know, believed that unless the Americans came in, we were probably sunk. I mean, the war was won. The largest casualties were not American, they were Russian, actually, about 25 million when they entered the war. But if the Americans hadn't come in when they did after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Russians hadn't been attacked by the Nazis, we would have either been defeated or, to my mind, even worse, had to accept a shameful peace. Anyway, he was there. So he wasn't speaking in an intra-academic way when he talked to me about tragic choices, when he talked about choices in which whatever you do, there is some irreparable loss or harm. He meant it. I'll briefly tell you one story he told me of the Second World War, which illustrates this. He knew a case where a senior civil servant appeared in his typing pool of, let's say, 20 people, and told them, I'm now going to do something which is very wrong. I'm going to sack every person in this typing pool because one of you has been leaking information to the enemy. And as a result of that leak, brave men and women who are being dropped behind enemy lines are being tortured to death and revealing information. So it's terrible for them, obviously, but also bad for the war effort. But what I'm doing is wrong because none of you will ever get a job in any legitimate employment again because you'll have a black security. So it'll be an irreparable wrong. Your lives will be ruined, but I'm going to do it anyway. Now, Berlin told me this story because it represented his view of ethics, and it represents mine too. which is that if you were what's called a utilitarian, you'd say, do the best thing with the best consequences, then there's nothing to regret. You've done the most rational thing. He thought there was something to regret. You've ruined these 19 of those people's lives irreparably for no good reason, because they're innocent. Or you might do what someone who wanted to keep their hands clean might do. They might say, I won't take the decision, I'll resign. He regarded that, as I regard that, as really cowardice. It's your job to take. I would have taken the same decision as he would. So what he illustrated to me, he taught me this basic truth, I think, which that human values are not coherent. They don't form into a single coherent set. They conflict with each other all the time. And that's why trying to impose a pattern on a human life, trying to engineer a better society, always goes wrong. And the ultimate reason is an anthropological reason. Humans are highly contradictory animals. They have needs that can never be, not just impulses or wants, but needs that can never be fully realized, never be fully recognized, reconciled with each other. So that's what I learned from him. He was also, of course, a fountainhead of stories about life in Russia and in Europe and in America. He knew everybody in America. Well, just as a slightly salacious side note, when he was in America, at Washington, he worked with Roald Dahl, the short story. They hated each other for reasons that he didn't go into, but Dahl was there also as part of the war effort to try and drag the Americans in. His job, Dahl's job, you can read about this now, was to sleep with the wives of important American senators and compromise them. And in an unverified story, where he was asked how he was feeling at one point, and he said, "I'm completely effed out." So that was his job there. And although they didn't get on, Dahl was a bit of an anti-Semite, remained one actually. They did work together. They even overlapped in an apartment. So Berlin knew what history, human events are really like. When he talked about this, it wasn't an intra-academic discourse. He knew what it meant to take, to either witness or take choices in which whatever you did, there was a terrible cost.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.